Usually when we talk about building something that lasts, like a monument or a movement or a real structural shift in society, there is this expectation of heavy materials.
Oh, absolutely. You want the blueprints.
Right. You want to change the world, so you write a dense policy manifesto. Or you draft complex legislation. Or you, I don't know, pound your fists on a podium outlining a highly specific 10-point plan.
Yeah, historically, protest movements have relied really heavily on that very direct, prescriptive language to mobilize people. You point at the problem, you name the villain, and you state the demand.
Exactly. We expect the tools of change to be solid, tangible, and, aggressively clear.
Hmm.
But then you look at one of the most enduring cultural monuments of the last century, and suddenly those blueprints are they're gone.
They really are.
We're looking at a construction made entirely of, like, smooth stones, a few leaves, and a gust of wind. It feels like it shouldn't hold up.
But it does.
It really does. So welcome to today's deep dive. We are so glad you're here with us. Today's stack of sources is a comprehensive, multi-part analysis of Bob Dylan's iconic 1960s track, Blowin' in the Wind.
Which is such a massive topic.
Huge. But our mission for you today isn't to just recount music history or read off a Wikipedia page about record sales. We are here to decode exactly why this specific song became this portable framework for thought.
Yeah, we're looking at how a song with zero institutional jargon, no specific policy proposals, and not a single direct accusation manages to maintain its moral pressure for decades.
Right, because on paper, it shouldn't work as a protest song.
Not at all. The power of the structure lies entirely in its open space. It's that distance between what is asked and what is answered. If you read the lyrics on paper stripped of the melody, it completely defies the logic of a traditional anthem.
It never actually tells you what to think.
Exactly. It forces you to realize what you are failing to notice.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand the song's massive impact, our sources tell us we first have to look at its structural DNA.
The foundational building blocks.
Yeah, and that DNA is absolute unfiltered simplicity. The lyrics rely on the most ordinary concrete imagery imaginable. We are talking about roads, seas, doves, cannonballs, mountains.
The guy's ears, eyes, deaths. Very elemental stuff.
Right. There is no bureaucratic jargon here. You won't find the words legislation or jurisprudence or even segregation or Cold War.
And that's by design. By entirely avoiding the political vocabulary of 1962, the song operates on an ethical register, not a programmatic one. It uses the psychological mechanism the sources call indirect activation.
Indirect activation. Okay, how does that work?
Well, when you hear the word cannonballs, your brain instantly activates the concept of organized violence, war, and destruction. And the songwriter doesn't have to explicitly debate foreign policy to get you there.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, or when you hear about a man turning his head and pretending he just doesn't see, you instantly recognize the concept of moral avoidance. It bypasses the intellect's defenses and just goes straight for the gut.
It reminds me of the specific way a toddler argues.
A toddler.
Hear me out on this. If an adult wants to debate you on a topic, they bring facts, figures, historical precedents, right?
Sure.
And as an adult, you can build a mental wall and defend against that. You can debate the statistics. But a toddler doesn't use statistics. A toddler just relentlessly asks why over and over again.
Oh, yeah. Why is the sky blue?
Right. Why do I have to go to bed? Why are people... and they keep doing it until they completely break down your adult rationalizations.
Yeah.
You're just left standing there confronting the sheer absurdity of the world we've built. The song kind of does this with the phrase, how many?
That is actually a perfect analogy. The sources specifically highlight that repetition as the core engine of the song. The repeated return to how many creates what the text calls a cumulative logic or moral accumulation.
Moral accumulation. I like that.
Yeah, you aren't being asked to evaluate a single isolated injustice. You are being subjected to this rhythmic cataloging of human failure.
But let me push back on this a little bit.
Yeah.
Because does simplicity risk becoming oversimplification?
What do you mean?
Well, in our world today, right, a world of short-form clips, 20-second sound bites, and algorithm-friendly headlines, simple language is usually the enemy of truth. It usually flattens the nuance out of everything until we are just left with meaningless slogans.
What's fascinating here is the critical distinction the sources make between being simplistic and being minimal.
Okay.
Oversimplification erases necessary complexity to make something easy to swallow. Minimalism, on the other hand, is a highly constructed choice to stage that complexity clearly.
So the words are small, But the image field they create is massive.
Exactly. By keeping the vocabulary plain, the song dramatically lowers the threshold for participation. You don't need a degree in political science or a deep understanding of geopolitical brinkmanship to understand what is at stake when a cannonball flies.
Right. It democratizes the moral question. Anyone can sing it, and anyone can understand the stakes.
Yeah.
Which I think brings us to the tension of the chorus.
The famous refrain.
Yeah. Because you build up all these intense accumulating questions, and human nature naturally demands a release valve. We want the answer. We've endured the toddler asking why 9 times, and now we want the definitive truth.
We want the resolution.
But the song's refrain defers that clarity entirely. It just says, the answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind.
It really is the core paradox of the entire work. The clarity is deliberately withheld.
To me, that feels like an unresolved chord in a piece of music. Like if you play a standard chord progression on a piano and you stop right before playing the final root note, the human brain demands the resolution.
Yes, the tension is almost physical.
You are sitting there waiting for the final note to strike so you can relax. But if the musician just walks away from the piano, you are left carrying that tension. But honestly, and the sources touch on this, if the answer is just in the wind, doesn't it let the listener off the hook?
How so?
Doesn't this ambiguity allow people to feel morally engaged, maybe sway back and forth with a lighter at a concert, without ever actually taking a stand or doing anything concrete?
This raises an important question, and it's the critique that the sources tackle head-on. Is this just contemplation without commitment?
Right.
But the text argues that this ambiguity is actually a brilliant indictment of our own evasion. It introduces this concept of the interpretive burden.
The interpretive burden. So
Yeah.
instead of the songwriter carrying the burden of explaining the solution, the person listening has to shoulder the weight of figuring out what to do next.
Precisely. If a songwriter says, we must march on City Hall tomorrow at noon to demand the repeal of Bill 402, the interpretive burden is entirely on the singer.
You just have to show up or stay home.
Right. You, the listener, just have to agree or disagree. But when the singer says the answer is blowing in the wind, it implies the truth isn't hidden in some secret, classified government archive.
It's all around us.
Exactly. The answers to war, to exclusion, to suffering, they are blowing right out in the open. They are visible in everyday public life. The problem isn't that we lack the data. The problem is our failure of response.
Wow. So the song is essentially holding up a mirror and saying, you already know the answer, you are just choosing to ignore the obvious.
Yeah, the song forces you to decide if you are going to act on what is already known. By refusing to give you a doctrinal solution to memorize, it transfers the responsibility entirely to the audience.
It makes your silence as the listener feel significantly less neutral.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can no longer claim ignorance.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Because once we understand how this song works on a mechanical level, the minimalism, the indirect activation, the interpretive burden, we have to look at the architectural foundation.
Where the structure actually came from.
Right. Because it didn't just appear out of nowhere.
Yeah.
The sources place the song squarely in the early 1960s, which was an intensely fraught era. We're talking racial terror, Cold War anxiety, and massive civil rights struggles.
The song did not emerge from a vacuum. The sources highlight that Dylan acknowledged a direct connection between his melody and an older African-American spiritual called No More Auction Block.
Which is a song rooted deeply in the history of enslaved people resisting their bondage.
Yes, very deeply rooted.
Now, in modern pop culture, that immediately sparks a massive debate about credit and cultural appropriation. We have an entire legal apparatus today built around who owns a chord progression or melodic phrase.
We absolutely do.
So we might look at this through a 21st century lens and ask, is this a brilliant original creation, or is it just theft?
And the sources carefully navigate this tension by explaining the mechanics of the folk process and the practice of revoicing.
Revoicing.
Yeah. In traditional folk environments, originality isn't defined by inventing something entirely out of nothing creation, ex nihilo, as the text calls it.
Making something from scratch.
Right. Originality in folk music is about transformation and utility. The folk process is a living, breathing method of oral transmission where songs are tools, and those tools are meant to be adapted for the survival of the community.
Okay, so you take an existing melodic foundation, because it already holds emotional resonance, and you build a new lyrical house on top of it to address whatever crisis you are facing today.
Yes, but it is deeper than simply borrowing notes. Think about the mechanics of how a spiritual operates. The tempo, the cadence, the specific intervals between the notes. They were often forged in secret or during grueling labor.
Designed to convey profound sorrow, but also incredible resilience.
Exactly. So when a musician places new, topical lyrics into that inherited melodic structure, the song literally carries the emotional memory of Black musical and spiritual traditions into a contemporary conflict.
Oh, wow.
The physical rhythm of past survival remains audible inside the present struggle.
That is so powerful. The melody itself is carrying the weight of history. Even if the new lyrics are talking about the present day, the listener is subconsciously feeling the gravity of generations of resistance.
They are. But the text provides a firm warning here, too. We must acknowledge this lineage without erasing the new lyrical achievement. We are navigating the very real tension between our modern system of legal authorship, which is obsessed with who gets the royalty check, and the much older, much more complex reality of cultural lineage.
It's a tricky balance.
It is. The folk process relies on inherited structures, but the synthesis of those structures with the specific moral anxieties of the 1960s was a unique architectural feat.
Okay, so this transformative folk song, carrying the heavy weight of the spirituals, eventually enters the broader public sphere.
Right, it doesn't stay a secret.
No, it moves out of the small folk clubs in Greenwich Village. It gets covered by massively popular artists like Peter, Paul, and Mary. It's sung collectively at massive rallies like the March on Washington. It becomes a monumental anthem.
A global phenomenon.
But it seems like wide circulation changes the nature of the tool itself.
Wide circulation profoundly alters how a song functions in society. It moves from the urgent, volatile space of a live movement into what the sources call heritage culture and collective memory.
You know, it feels akin to taking a vital, dangerous tool, say, a blacksmith's hammer that was used to forge literal chains of resistance, and placing it behind velvet robes in a brightly lit museum.
Right, it's preserved perfectly.
And millions of people can walk by and admire it, but it's no longer being used to strike the anvil. It has lost its active utility. When a song becomes this culturally sacred, this canonized, the listener might stop hearing the actual challenge in the lyrics.
Because they're too busy revering it as a piece of safe historical nostalgia.
Exactly. Does it lose its teeth?
The sources agree this is a major vulnerability for any protest art. When a song achieves anthem status, sheer repetition can produce reverence without reflection. The text outlines two specific, heavily debated criticisms regarding how this song operated at the height of its fame.
Okay, let's look at the first one. The problem of abstraction. If the language is designed to be entirely universal, asking about how many roads and how many seas, doesn't that risk erasing the specific people who are actually suffering in the 1960s?
Yes.
Because the concrete life-or-death struggles of Black Americans facing fire hoses and police dogs could just, recede behind this vague, poetic universalism.
That is exactly the critique of abstraction. Universal language is powerful because it includes everyone, but its fatal flaw is that it can flatten historical specificity.
It makes it too broad.
Yeah, a white college student in a comfortable suburb could sing about the wind and feel a sense of moral accomplishment without ever having to confront the specific violent realities of Jim Crow laws happening in the South. The broadness allows the listener to feel ethical without demanding any specific political solidarity.
Which feeds right into the second criticism the sources mentioned, which is canon asymmetry.
Yes, canon asymmetry.
This seems to be about how the music industry's mechanics actually enforce inequality, even within a civil rights movement. Like, if a white artist writes a massively famous, universally palatable song, the industry machinery, radio play, television appearances, publishing rights just throws all its weight behind that one track.
The industry consolidates attention. Canon asymmetry happens when a highly visible song absorbs the oxygen in the room, overshadowing the works of artists from the communities most directly affected by the injustice.
It creates a skewed historical record.
Exactly. The public attention that might otherwise have gone to a broader field of Black voices, activists, and songwriters gets funneled into a single canonical anthem.
The shadow of the monument ends up hiding the people standing at its base.
That's a great way to put it. But it's important to note, the sources don't present these criticisms to dismiss the song entirely. We aren't taking sides here, just reporting what the text says.
Right, of course.
The analysis in the text emphasizes that acknowledging these limits matures our understanding of how symbolic politics work. A song can be incredibly powerful in shifting a generation's moral vocabulary while simultaneously being limited by industry dynamics and its own abstraction.
Acknowledging its flaws doesn't erase its utility.
Precisely.
Which brings us to the ultimate test of any piece of art, really, surviving its own era. Despite the valid criticisms of abstraction and canon asymmetry, and despite its specific origins in the 1960s, this song hasn't faded into empty nostalgia.
No, it didn't just stay in the museum.
It is constantly referenced today, actively used in completely different contexts globally. So why hasn't it just faded away?
Our sources explicitly tie the song's survival to the nature of our current digital environment. Think about how you consume information right now.
Oh, it's overwhelming.
Right. We are living in an era defined by fragmented information streams, doom scrolling, and relentless 24-hour outrage cycles.
So what does this all mean for the song? If it was engineered for the age of the Cold War and segregated lunch counters, how does its DNA apply to you and me scrolling through our phones today? I mean, we're looking at a dozen different global crises, climate disasters, wars, economic collapses, before we've even finished our morning coffee.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the text introduces the concept of adaptive interpretation.
Okay.
The song survives and continues to function as a tool because the core human flaw it diagnoses has not been solved.
The delay. The text talks a lot about the agonizing delay between ethical recognition and institutional action.
Yes.
The time it takes between society collectively seeing that something is horribly wrong and society actually altering its structures to stop it.
In our digital age, massive, horrific suffering can be normalized just through sheer repetition on our screens. We see so much tragedy that it becomes background noise.
It really does.
So the song's relentless focus on the physical, anatomical acts of seeing and hearing suffering, like how many ears must one man have before he can hear people cry, is hyper-relevant.
It provides a durable framework for you, the listener, today. When you are doom scrolling, the song forces you to look at your screen and ask, how much evidence of suffering does society actually need to witness before we move from passively recognizing it to actively dismantling it?
It prevents the listener from claiming they just need more data before they can make a decision.
Data's all there.
The song argues that the evidence is already there, yeah. The delay is not a matter of ignorance. The delay is a choice.
Wow. Bringing this deep dive to a close, let's look at the core nuggets of insight we've pulled from this stack of sources today. Blowin' in the Wind isn't just a catchy tune from the 60s.
Far from it.
It is a masterclass in the structural restraint. It uses simple, universal imagery, indirect activation, and unanswered questions to apply immense moral pressure.
It creates a space where moral debate becomes unavoidable. It forces you, the listener, to carry the interpretive burden of the world's injustices, rather than waiting for a politician or a songwriter to hand you a neatly packaged solution.
This deep dive highlights something profound about the function of art in society. Art doesn't have to give us the policy solutions. It doesn't need the blueprints, the concrete, or the heavy materials we talked about at the start.
Right.
What it gives us is the moral vocabulary to judge those policies and, more importantly, to judge our own passivity.
Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over, drawn from the tensions we've explored today. We've talked about how this song united a generation's moral anxiety through a single shared cultural moment.
Yeah.
But look at our media ecosystem today. It is entirely fractured by algorithms designed to show us only what we already agree with.
That's very true.
So the question is, what happens to the interpretive burden when we no longer share the same reality? Could a single song ever command that kind of collective moral attention today, or have algorithms made it impossible for society to ever sit together and listen to the same unresolved chord?
Man, that is a heavy thought. It makes you wonder if the wind is still blowing or if we've just built too many walls to even feel it. Thanks for joining us to decode the sources today. Catch you next time.